Your lecturer is Douglas O. Linder. Professor Linder is the Elmer Powell Peer Professor of Law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law. He received his J.D. from Stanford Law School. For more than 2 decades, Professor Linder has taught a seminar in famous trials using his own materials published on his Famous Trials website, which is the most visited trial-related site on the internet. In addition, he has appeared in televised documentaries and interviews about great trials. Professor Linder is the co-author of 2 books, The Good Lawyer and The Happy Lawyer.
Welcome to a tour of some of the greatest trials in world history. We're going to cover a lot of ground together, from ancient Athens to 20th century America. We're going to encounter multiple cultures and various notions of justice. But one common thread will run through our course. Each of the trials we discuss deserves to be called a great trial. What does it mean, though, to be called a great trial? Well, different legal scholars might offer different answers to that question. For example, some might focus on brilliant tactical ploys or eloquent speeches. Others might highlight trials that produce an especially enlightened or just result. But as you'll see, the participants in some of the trials I've chosen don't actually perform all that impressively. And sometimes the juries produce infuriatingly unfair results. So, what are my criteria for calling a trial great? I'd like to point to 2 benchmarks. First, the trial must have stirred people, grabbed people's attention. In other words, every one of the trials I've chosen was famous in its own time and place. Being a famous trial, however, is not enough. To land a spot in our course, a trial must also have shaped history in some important way, or be an especially good window for observing a particular place in time. Over the next 24 lectures, we'll encounter a wide range of crucial issues: freedom of speech, the death penalty, the meaning of equality. And the trials that grapple or fail to grapple with these issues are often trials of enduring consequence. Some of the trials advanced social causes, like the Amistad trial, which lent support to the abolitionist movement, or the trial of the so-called Scottsboro Boys, which brought the races together in support of civil rights. Others are important because of the way they went awry, because they show us how prosecutors can jump to conclusions, then disregard any evidence that undermines their assumptions. The witchcraft trials in Salem and the McMartin preschool case are just 2 examples of this sad tendency. But regardless of their conduct or their outcome, every case we'll look at offers lessons that we can use today, lessons that can bring us closer to our highest ideals of justice. So with these criteria for a great trial in mind, let's start our tour in ancient Athens. The year is 399 BC, and it's a late spring morning in the People's Court. Here in the Agora, the civic center of the great Greek city, 500 citizens, most of them probably farmers, sit outside on wooden benches. They are separated from the crowd of spectators by a barrier. One of those spectators on the other side of the barrier is a 27-year-old named Plato. He has come to watch the trial of his 70-year-old teacher, Socrates. The 500 men inside the barrier are his jurors. Before the sun sets, they will sentence Socrates to death. Most of what we know about the trial of Socrates comes to us from Plato's writings, and Plato is hardly an unbiased observer. The same can be said about Xenophon, the author of the only other surviving account of the trial and also a disciple of Socrates. There is good reason to suspect that Plato and Xenophon wanted to present their master in a favorable light. it is likely that their accounts leave out some of the most damning evidence against Socrates and some of the most powerful arguments for his guilt. So this presents us with a puzzle. What we do not know from our surviving trial accounts that might explain why 500 Athenians would send a 70-year-old philosopher to his death. Why, in a society enjoying more freedom and democracy than the world had ever seen, would Socrates be put to death for what he was teaching? The puzzle is all the greater because Socrates had taught without molestation for nearly his entire adult life. What did Socrates say or do that caused a jury to demand his execution just a few years before he would have died naturally? This we can say. The decision to prosecute and ultimately convict Socrates is very connected to the turbulent history of Athens in the several years preceding his trial. Socrates, as a young boy, saw the rise of Pericles. It was the dawn of the golden age of Greece. Pericles, perhaps history's first liberal politician, helped bring about a fundamental power shift. For the first time, the masses, and not just the property-owning aristocrats, enjoyed liberty. Pericles created the People's Court, used the public treasury to promote the arts, and pushed ahead with an unprecedented building program designed not only to demonstrate the glory that was Greece, but also to ensure full employment. The rebuilding of the Acropolis and the construction of the Parthenon were just two of the best-known projects of Pericles' many ambitious building projects. Despite growing to adulthood in this bastion of liberalism and democracy, Socrates developed a set of beliefs that put him at odds with most of his fellow Athenians. Socrates was not a democrat or an egalitarian. To him, the people should not be self-governing. They were like a herd of sheep that needed the direction of a wise shepherd. He told anyone who would listen that they were fuzzy thinkers, knew nothing, and worried about trivial things rather than about what really mattered. Striking at the heart of Athenian democracy, he criticized the right of every citizen to speak in the Athenian assembly. Writing in the 3rd century, in his The Lives of Eminent Philosophers, Diogenes Laertius reported that Socrates discussed moral questions in the workshops and the marketplace. Often his unpopular views, expressed with an air of condescension, provoked his listeners to anger. Laertius wrote that the men set upon him with their fists or tore his hair out, but that Socrates bore all this ill usage patiently. We get a contemporary view of Socrates from the playwright Aristophanes. In his play Clouds, produced in 423 BC, Aristophanes presents Socrates as an eccentric headmaster of a thinkery. He is portrayed as stalking the streets of Athens barefoot and rolling his eyes at remarks he finds unintelligent. Clouds suggests a 40-something Socrates was seen more as a harmless town character than as a serious threat to Athenian values and democracy. Less than a decade later, another Aristophanes play, Birds, refers to Socrates again. Aristophanes labels a gang of pro-Sparta aristocratic youths as Socratified. Sparta, the model of a closed society, was Athens' enemy. So perhaps by 414 BC, Socrates' teaching had begun to seem more subversive than it did before. The standing of Socrates among his fellow citizens fell further during two periods in which Athenian democracy was temporarily overthrown by the Spartans and their allies. The prime movers in both anti-democratic movements, the first in 411 to 410 and the second in 404 to 403, were former pupils of Socrates, Alcibiades and Critias. Athenians considered the teachings of Socrates, especially his disdain for the established constitution, partially responsible for the death and suffering during those two awful periods. Alcibiades, perhaps Socrates' favorite Athenian politician, masterminded the first overthrow, and Critias established an oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. after the second bloody revolt in 404. The 30 tyrants turned Athens into a police state for 8 months. Thugs with daggers and whips roamed the streets, murdering opponents. Many of Athens' leading citizens went into exile, where they organized a resistance movement. It is no coincidence that Anytus, the likely instigator of the prosecution of Socrates, was among the exiles. Critias cruelly determined to recast Athens in an anti-democratic mold, whatever the human costs. His oligarchy confiscated the estates of Athenian aristocrats, banished 5,000 women, children, and slaves, and summarily executed about 1,500 of Athens' most prominent Democrats. One incident involving Socrates and the 30 tyrants would become an issue at his trial. Although the 30 tyrants normally used their own gang of thugs for such duties, the oligarchy asked Socrates to arrest Leon of Salamis. After his arrest, the tyrants planned to execute him and seize his assets. Socrates, to his credit, refused to make the arrest. And yet, Socrates did not protest, nor did he take any step to warn Leon of Salamis of his impending arrest. Socrates just said, "The hell with it," and went home. When the good citizens of Athens were being liquidated right and left, Socrates, so far as we know, did nothing to stop the bloodshed. In the trial, Socrates would point to his resistance to the arrest order as evidence of his good conduct. He would contend that he was a neutral in the conflict, siding neither with the oligarchs nor with the Democrats. Yet, after the horrors brought on by the 30 tyrants, Socrates would hardly have seemed harmless to any good Athenian Democrat. He was not just an overbearing town eccentric. Socrates was now a dangerous and corrupting influence, a breeder of tyrants, and an enemy of the common man. And yet, a general amnesty issued in 403 meant that Socrates could not be prosecuted for any of his actions during or before the reign of the 30 tyrants. For Socrates to face trial, it had to be for actions he took in the 4 years between the restoration of the democracy and his trial in 399 BC. So what happened during that 4-year span? We know that Socrates resumed his teachings. Once again, it appears, he began attracting a band of youthful followers. The final straw may well have been another anti-democratic uprising, this one unsuccessful, in 401. Athenians finally had had enough of their know-it-all busybody. It was time to send a message that the city would do whatever it took to defend its precious democracy. So let's return to 399 and walk through the trial process itself. And the first thing we should note is that in ancient Athens, any citizen could initiate criminal proceedings against anyone else. There was no public prosecutor. Accusers were not required to pay any court costs. To discourage frivolous suits, Athenian law imposed heavy fines on any citizen accusers who were unable to win the votes of 1/5 of the jurors. The first accuser of Socrates was a poet, and probably not a very good one at that, named Meletus. He probably had been offended by Socrates' attacks on poets such as himself. Most likely also, Meletus was very religious and had a gripe with Socrates' irreverence. Meletus was the youngest of Socrates' 3 accusers. Plato describes him as having a beak, long, straight hair, and an ugly beard. But you wouldn't expect Plato to paint a flattering portrait, would you? In the presence of witnesses, Meletus delivered an oral summons to Socrates to appear before the legal magistrate, or king archon. Under Athenian law, Socrates had the option to forego the hearing and exile himself voluntarily. But he decided to enter a plea. On his way to the magistrate, Socrates stopped by a gymnasium to talk with some youths about mathematics and knowledge. Then at the Royal Stoa, a colonnaded building in central Athens, he launched into a conversation with a soothsayer on the subject of reverence. The man just can't stop moralizing. Now, the plea that Meletus handed over to the magistrate charged Socrates with impiety and corrupting the youth. The impiety charge stemmed from Socrates' repeated suggestion to the gods of the Athenians were not his gods. Socrates had said that he could not imagine gods doing quarrelsome and vindictive things that the poets claimed they did. It's possible, we just don't know for sure, that Anytus and Lycon, the second and third accusers of Socrates, were also present and added their voices to the charges. Lycon was an orator, but we know little about his motivation for accusing Socrates. Anytus, on the other hand, was a well-known politician, highly influential, and the driving force behind the prosecution. And he had a number of reasons to be upset with Socrates. For starters, Anytus' son had a relationship with Socrates. Plato, in his Meno, quotes Socrates as saying, "I had a brief association with the son of Anytus, and I found him not lacking in spirit." This brief association to which Socrates referred probably included sex. Socrates, like many men of his time in Athens, slept with other men. It is not much of a leap to assume that Anytus disapproved of Socrates' relationship with his son. He probably also had a gripe with advice Socrates gave his son. Anytus came from a family of tanners. According to Xenophon, Socrates urged Anytus' son not to continue in the servile occupation of tanning hides that his father provided him. Rather, Socrates told his son, he needed a worthy advisor, perhaps like himself, or he risked falling into a life of disgraceful propensity and vice. Apart from his personal issues with Socrates, Anytus took deep offense with the anti-democratic political message Socrates spread among the youth of Athens. Plato writes that Anytus was enraged by Socrates' argument that the great statesmen of Athenian history lacked a real understanding of the meaning of virtue. Plato quotes Anytus as offering this warning: "Socrates, I think you are too ready to speak evil of men. I recommend you be careful." Anytus likely was also disgusted with Socrates' connection to Critias. He viewed with disdain Socrates' utter disregard for the havoc and heartache that the 30 tyrants caused. After listening to Meletus' and perhaps Anytus' and Lycon's accusation, Socrates answered the charges. He claimed that he was guilty neither of impiety nor of corrupting the youth. The Archon, after considering the charges and the answers, issued his ruling. The lawsuit was permissible and could proceed. He then set a date for what we might call a preliminary hearing. Anachrisis is the Greek term for the proceeding. A public notice was posted on the royal stove. At the preliminary hearing, the magistrate questioned Meletus and Socrates about the two charges. Then he gave both Meletus and Socrates an opportunity to question each other. After hearing from both the accuser and the accused, the magistrate took written depositions from witnesses for the prosecution. In the trial itself, there would be no live witnesses. The magistrate then formalized the charges in a document and set a date for trial. Notices of the upcoming trial were posted. Nearly everyone in Athens knew Socrates. His trial would be a very big deal. To return to our criteria for what makes a great trial, this was one that definitely grabbed the people's attention. The formal document charging Socrates survived at least until the 3rd century AD. We know that because historian Diogenes Laertius, writing at that time, offered a verbatim report of the now lost document. This indictment and affidavit is sworn by Meletus against Socrates. Socrates is guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state and of introducing new divinities. He's also guilty of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded is death. A month or two after Meletus delivered his summons, the day of the trial arrives. It would take place over a 9 to 10 hour period in the People's Court. Each of the 500 jurors, all over the minimum age of 30, had signed up for jury duty. 500 or 501 by some accounts seems like an awful lot of jurors. With a jury that size, though, Athenians knew, any attempt to fix a jury was doomed. Each juror was paid 3 obols for his service, a sum so meager that volunteers for the jury skewed disproportionately old and poor. The trial began with the herald reading the formal charges against Socrates. Then all eyes turned to the elevated stage on which the 3 accusers stood. Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon would have a total of 3 hours, measured by a water clock, to address the jury. Now, unfortunately, neither I nor anyone else can tell you exactly what the accusers told the jurors. No record of the prosecution's argument against Socrates survives. But we can make educated guesses based on the accounts of what Socrates said in his defense. Historians disagree as to whether the accusers focused more attention on the alleged political crimes of Socrates or on the alleged religious crimes. I.F. Stone, in his The Trial of Socrates, believes that the political crimes were far more important, whereas James Koleiakou, author of Socrates Against Athens, gives more weight to the charge of impiety. So could impiety really have been what did Socrates in? Well, piety for Athenians had a broad meaning. It included not just respect for the gods, but also for the dead and for ancestors. The impious individual was seen as a contaminant, a person who, if not controlled or punished, might bring upon the city the wrath of the gods in the form of plague or sterility. It's safe to assume that Socrates was not a model of piety. He failed to attend state-sponsored religious festivals, such as those honoring Athena or Dionysus. In Athens, you were expected to show up for these events. And he stirred resentment by arguing against the ritualistic view of religion shared by most Athenians. He also criticized the commonly held belief that the gods were sometimes capable of behaving immorally or whimsically. In contrast to Koleiakou, however, I.F. Stone contends that most Athenians would have shrugged off the impiety charge. Stone writes, Athenians were accustomed to hearing the gods treated disrespectfully in both comic and tragic theater. He points out that the Aristophanes in The Clouds had a character speculate that rain was Zeus urinating through a sieve, mistaking it for a chamber pot. No one ever bothered to charge Aristophanes with impiety. Stone concludes, one could, in the same city, in the same century, worship Zeus as a promiscuous old rake, henpecked by Juno, or as justice deified. It was the political, not the theological views of Socrates, which finally got him into trouble. Important support for Stone's conclusion comes from the earliest surviving reference to the child Socrates that does not come from one of his disciples. In 345 BC, the orator Aeschines told a jury, Men of Athens, you executed Socrates, the sophist, because he was clearly responsible for the education of Critias, one of the 30 anti-democratic leaders. So Stone, I think, has the better of the argument. The political charge is the more potent. It is not a stretch to think of the charge against Socrates as treason. In Athens' most dire time, Socrates gave aid and comfort to her enemies. In the end, we cannot be sure which charge stung more, but a vote to convict was a vote to convict. It didn't matter which of the charges a juror found more persuasive. After the prosecution rested, Socrates rose to deliver his apology, a word that comes from the Greek apologia, meaning defense. Plato's apology is far from a word-for-word record of what Socrates said. For all we know, the defense case might have even included speeches by Socrates' supporters, not just Socrates. The accounts of Plato and Xenophon agree on a key point. In both accounts, Socrates gives a defiant, decidedly unapologetic speech. A speech so defiant, he has to silence a jeering crowd several times to continue. Socrates all but invites condemnation and death. He insists that by asking his awkward questions, he has performed a valuable service and that he has no intention of stopping. So long as he has a breath to draw, he will continue to push people to seek the truth. Athenian law allowed the defendant to cross-examine his accuser, and Plato has Socrates using his trademark Socratic method to make Meletus look like a fool. Meletus says that Socrates corrupts the young, but has a hard time explaining why he would want to do this. Socrates argues that if he did in fact corrupt the young, it was done out of ignorance. No man of any intelligence would choose to intentionally corrupt the people he has to live with. Plato's Socrates provocatively tells his jurors he is a hero. He reminds them of his exemplary service in 3 battles and tells them that, as a philosopher, he has fought for decades to save the souls of Athenians. He would rather be put to death than give up his soul saving. Men of Athens, he says, I honor and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy. If Plato's account is accurate, the jury knew that the only way to stop Socrates from lecturing about the moral weaknesses of Athenians was to kill him. In the Apology, Socrates also addresses the question of his association with the 30 tyrants, suggesting that if Critias really understood his words, really grasped what he said about virtue, he never would have gone on the bloody rampage that he did. Socrates also points to his refusal to comply with the tyrant's order to bring in Leonus Salamis for execution. Socrates argues this act of disobedience, an act which might have led to his own execution, demonstrates his service as a good citizen of Athens. After perhaps a 3-hour defense, Socrates finally sat down. It's not hard to imagine that his defense created an uproar. Spectators heckled. Jurors shook their heads. Next, the court herald told the jurors it was time to render their decision. They were to put their wheel-shaped ballot discs into one of 2 marked urns, one for guilty votes and one for votes for acquittal. There was no judge to offer them instructions as to how to interpret the charges or the law. There was no time for group deliberation. Each juror had to struggle to reach his own conclusion. So the jurors streamed into line and deposited their discs into the 2 urns. When they were finished, the herald called for quiet, and the magistrate announced the verdict. 280 jurors found Socrates guilty. 220 jurors voted for acquittal. A close vote, but enough under Athenian law for a conviction. For a majority of the jurors, Socrates was not just a harmless, truth-seeking crank. He was dangerous, even an accessory to mass murder. After the conviction was announced, the trial entered its penalty phase. In this, each side, and the accusers and the defendant, proposed a punishment. And after listening to the arguments, the jurors chose which of the 2 punishments to adopt. The accusers of Socrates proposed death. Socrates could have countered with a proposal for exile, a punishment that probably would have satisfied both the accusers and the jury. He could have made a sort of plea for mercy that was typically made to Athenian jurors. Usually, defendants appealed to the sympathies of jurors by introducing wives and children. Socrates, however, merely reminded the jury that he had a family. Neither his wife Xanthippe or any of his 3 sons made a personal appearance. In fact, Socrates contended that the unmanly practice of pleading for clemency disgraced the justice system of Athens. Even more surprising, perhaps, Socrates audaciously proposed that to the jury that he be rewarded, not punished. According to Plato, Socrates asked the jury for free meals for life in a public dining hall in the center of Athens. This was an honor given to Olympic victors. Surely, Socrates said, he has performed a service greater than that of any Olympic athlete. Socrates had to know that this proposed punishment would infuriate the jury. I.F. Stone says that, quote, Socrates acts more like a picador trying to enrage a bull than a defendant trying to mollify a jury. Now, why propose a punishment guaranteed to be rejected? The only answer can be that Socrates was ready to die. Faced with the demand to come up with a genuine punishment, Socrates suggested a fine of 1 mina of silver, about 1/5 of his modest net worth, according to Xenophon. Plato and other supporters of Socrates upped the offer by agreeing to come up with some silver of their own. But it's too little, too late. In the final vote, a larger majority of jurors favored a punishment of death than had voted for conviction in the first place. Rather a remarkable fact. 360 jurors voted for death, 140 for the fine. Under Athenian law, execution would be accomplished by drinking a cup of poisoned hemlock. As court officials finished their work, Socrates offered a few memorable words, including the prediction that history would come to see his conviction as shameful for Athens. Then the trial was over. The jurors made their way back to their homes. How many, one wonders, would come to later regret their decision? Socrates spent his final days in a cell. The ruins of the jail cell remain and are a minor tourist attraction in Athens. According to Plato, a man named Crito bribed a juror and made plans to smuggle Socrates out of prison. But Socrates refused to participate in any escape plan. When the time of execution arrived, Socrates bathed to spare his survivors the trouble of washing his body. He said goodbye to his wife and 3 children. He didn't want to see them crying. Near sunset, he took a cup of hemlock from the executioner and drank it in one gulp. He walked for a bit and then lay down on a bed as the paralysis set in. As the paralysis moved towards his heart, he told his friends in the cell not to weep. His final words were, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay it. The execution and conviction of Socrates is best seen as a deliberate choice made by the philosopher himself. If the accounts of Plato and Xenophon are accurate, Socrates sought not to persuade jurors, but rather to lecture them. The trial of Socrates thus became the most interesting suicide the world has ever seen. Had he wanted to, Socrates could have won an acquittal. The closeness of the vote shows that there was nothing inevitable about his sentence. If he had been less condescending, less confrontational, less arrogant, if he had argued that he was just exercising his basic right of free speech, a right of which Athenians were justly proud, jurors might have been much more receptive. But Socrates couldn't bring himself to rely on a principle he had so often criticized. He was uncompromising. He showed no hint of respect for Athens or her institutions. For Socrates, being a good person came first, being a good citizen, a poor second. As a matter of personal integrity, he chose to make Athenians decide between their love of freedom and their love of community. And in the end, they chose community. Socrates knew how to die. The manner in which he chose to die enhanced his reputation among his associates and made him the first great martyr for the cause of free speech, a sort of secular saint. As I.F. Stone observed, just as Jesus needed the cross to fulfill his mission, Socrates needed hemlock to fulfill his.